An audit reveals false freight charges and stolen widow funds within these accounts.
At the winter
Concealed by
dividend
a
assembly
hidden
at
debt
Blackthorn
transfer.
House, the men who had once watched Alina Vermont be traded across a table now expected her to stand quietly behind her husband's chair and look grateful for the privilege. Instead, she stepped in front of the ledgers. The long counting room smelled of sealing wax, damp wool, and iron smoke drifting in from the lower furnaces. Merchants from Baltimore sat stiff-backed along one wall. Tenant agents and shipping partners crowded the other. At the far end of the room, beneath a row of tall windows clouded with sleet, Lucian Draven, Duke of Blackthorn, stood with the stillness that had made lesser men mistake silence for mercy. They were not looking at him. They were looking at his wife. 3 months earlier, those same men had whispered that his grace had purchased a bride the way another gentleman might purchase a carriage horse, quickly, coldly, and with money no decent girl's father should have touched. They had expected embarrassment to make her obedient. They had expected rank to turn her ornamental. They had expected the humiliation of a forced marriage to finish what family betrayal had begun. They had not expected her to learn every artery of Blackthorn's failing estate, trace every lie inside its ledgers, and walk into a room full of creditors holding the knife by the handle. Alina laid one gloved hand over the open account book before her. "Before any dividend is discussed," she said, her voice calm enough to make the silence around it sharper, "the gentlemen present ought to know that Blackthorn's losses were not caused by war alone, nor by weather, nor by the laziness of tenants, as has been so confidently repeated in this room." A rustle passed among the chairs. At the sideboard, her father, Gideon Vermont, let out one dry laugh meant to sound worldly. "My daughter has lately mistaken household arithmetic for commerce." That was how he always did it. Never a shout, never an open blow, only the polished reduction of her mind in public, as if he were sparing others the trouble of taking her seriously. Several men smiled with cautious relief. They knew how to read that tone. It allowed them to dismiss a woman without seeming vulgar. Alina turned one page. "I have no wish to discuss household arithmetic," she said. "Only the 27 false freight charges entered under the Kersey factors. The furnace charcoal contracts billed twice under names belonging to dead laborers. The coin advances recorded to widows who never received them, and the marriage settlement by which my father attempted to conceal his own debt transfer under the language of filial protection." That ended the smiling. Across the room, Matthew Kersey, chief factor of the Blackthorn Works, went pale beneath the ruddiness he carried from years of good wine and hot rooms. Gideon Vermont's face did not yet change. That was what had once made him formidable. He had spent too many years living inside deceit to flinch at the first accusation. Lucian said nothing. He did not rescue her. He did not interrupt. He did not claim the floor merely because he could. He had promised her that if the reckoning came, it would be hers to lead. So the room remained hers. "If my father wishes," Alina continued, "I can begin with the forged signatures. If Mr. Kersey prefers, I can begin with the missing iron consignments routed through Elk Ridge under proxy names. But because both gentlemen have profited from the same fraud, I thought it more efficient to address them together." No one moved. Near the windows, Colonel Fenwick lowered the cup in his hand without drinking. An elderly merchant from Annapolis leaned forward as if age itself had retreated from him. Even the clerk by the fire had stopped pretending to write. The most dangerous moment in a room like that was not when outrage burst. It was when calculation began. And Alina knew with a clarity that felt almost cold in her bones, that the room had begun to calculate. If you favor stories in which the woman everyone mistakes for a payment becomes the mind that remakes an empire, stay with Quiet Fires of America. Because when Alina Vermont signed the paper her father placed before her, she believed she was witnessing the ruin of her life. She did not yet know she was opening the door through which she would reclaim her name, rescue her sister's future, and teach a feared duke that partnership could be fiercer than possession. It had begun in late autumn, with rain on the window glass, and her father smiling too gently. By then, the Vermont house in Tidewater, Maryland, still looked prosperous to strangers. The silver was polished, the front path was swept. Gideon Vermont continued to receive collars and coats trimmed just expensively enough to suggest that nothing inside his life had slipped. But the sugar jars were thinner, the servants more anxious, and every third conversation ended when Alina entered the room. She had learned long before that secrecy changed the shape of a household before it changed the accounts. Her mother had taught her numbers as other women taught embroidery, not because Mrs. Vermont had been radical, but because she had been practical. A woman might not sit openly at every table, she used to say, but she must know what has been wagered there. So Alina had grown up reading cargo tallies, estate rents, seed costs, shipping notes, and parish obligations in the quiet hours before supper. She understood weight, delay, margin, spoilage, and debt. She understood, too, the expression men wore when they wished a woman to know nothing while depending daily on her invisible accuracy. After her mother died, Gideon Vermont praised that intelligence only when it served him. He called Alina capable in private and overreaching in public. He asked her to correct columns, copy correspondence, and calm creditors, but if she drew conclusions from the same papers he handed her, he smiled as though she had wandered beyond the limits of her sex. It was a habit so refined that many took it for paternal fondness. Alina knew better. She was 23 when the first undeniable fracture appeared. A tobacco consignment her father claimed had been delayed by river trouble had, in truth, already been sold. A loan against the family townhouse had been renewed twice without her knowledge. Her younger sister, Clara, whose dowry trust their mother had secured with painstaking care, was suddenly being discussed as if her future were flexible. That word lodged in Alina's mind like a splinter. Flexible for whom? When she pressed for answers, Gideon told her not to distress herself with masculine burdens. When she persisted, he kissed her brow and said she had inherited too much vigilance from her mother. When she requested to see the full papers relating to Clara's trust, he informed her those matters were already under legal review. That was the first time Alina became certain she was being managed rather than protected. The second came 2 weeks later, when a creditor called at dusk and addressed her by mistake, as if she were the one expected to understand the balance due. "Surely your father has explained the Draven arrangement," the man said. He looked almost ill when he realized he had spoken too much. Alina kept her face smooth. "He has explained many arrangements poorly, sir. You may distinguish this one by speaking plainly." The man muttered an apology and fled into the rain. But that single name remained. Draven. She had heard it all her life. Lucian Draven, Duke of Blackthorn, held one of the largest river estates in the region, iron furnaces inland, warehouses near the port, tenant lands, timber rights, and a shipping interest that had survived war by becoming harder rather than weaker. He was not loved. Men respected him the way they respected winter roads, because they knew they could break their necks if they misjudged him. Women described him as controlled, distant, and impossible to flatter. He had inherited a magnificent burden, and spent years stripping extravagance from it with such ruthless discipline that half the county thought him cold and the other half thought him dangerous. Alina thought him irrelevant, until her father placed the contract in front of her. It was done at his study table after supper, with a coal fire burning low and Clara upstairs at her music. Gideon spoke in the voice he used when he wished coercion to resemble reason. "There is an opportunity before us," he said. "One that may preserve this family from embarrassment." He set the papers near her hand. Alina did not touch them immediately. "What kind of opportunity requires witnesses from your solicitor and none from your daughters?" His mouth tightened, though his smile remained. "A marriage settlement." The room seemed, for one strange moment, to move away from her. "A what?" "A prudent alliance. His Grace of Blackthorn has agreed to assume certain pressing obligations in exchange for a union that will strengthen both houses. You are of a proper age. He requires a wife with steadiness rather than frivolity. The arrangement is sound." Alina looked down at the first page. The language was formal, polished, almost elegant in its violence. Debts, property guarantees, transfer clauses, security against outstanding obligations. Her own name appeared again and again, not as a person at the center of a life, but as a hinge on which liabilities might be moved. "You have sold me to cover your debts." Gideon did not deny it. He only changed vocabulary. "I have placed you where your future will be safe." She rose so quickly the chair struck the boards behind her. "And Clara? What have you pledged from Clara's future while you speak to me of safety?" For the first time, something ugly showed through. "Mind your tone," he said quietly. "You have enjoyed the shelter of this household all your life. Do not posture now as if you were dragged to sacrifice after contributing nothing." Nothing. She thought of the ledgers she had balanced for him, the letters she had written, the creditors she had soothed, the little economies by which she had kept the house from visible decline, the nights she had sat with Clara so the girl would not hear arguments through the walls. Nothing. Gideon slid the quill toward her. "If this marriage fails," he said, "the creditors will not stop at me. They will come through the trust protections. Clara's dowry may be delayed for years in litigation. The townhouse will go. Your mother's name will be discussed in taverns. And because society loves a fallen family less than it loves the spectacle of one, no friend will intervene when gossip begins. Sign, Alina. Whatever romance you imagined for yourself was never likely to feed a household." That was the true brutality of men like Gideon Vermont. They did not merely wound you. They used your love for others as the instrument. Alina signed, not because she accepted his right, because Clara was 17, and she would not let her sister's life be swallowed by a debt pit their father had dug with elegant hands. When the ink dried, Gideon exhaled as though order had been restored. "His Grace will call tomorrow." He did. Lucian Draven arrived in a dark coat still marked by the weather, his presence filling the doorway without theatricality. He was taller than rumor had made him, harsher too, not handsome in any sweet way, but cut from the sort of restraint that drew attention because it did not seek it. His eyes rested on Alina exactly once before moving to the contract on the desk. He did not congratulate her. He did not thank Gideon. He said, "Miss Vermont, I would speak with you privately, if your father can spare the illusion of generosity for 10 minutes. Gideon laughed in a manner meant to show broad confidence. "Of course, we are all family now." "No," said Lucian without raising his voice. "We are not." That was the first thing about him that surprised her. The second came once the door had closed. Lucian stood beside the mantel rather than approaching her. "I was told you had agreed to this settlement after full disclosure." I agreed under coercion. A flicker passed through his face, not surprise exactly, but confirmation. I thought as much. Alina stared at him. And yet you came. I came because Blackthorn requires liquid stability, and your father offered a marriage alliance tied to land securities that suited my immediate needs. He paused. I also came because I suspected Gideon Vermont was desperate enough to lie in more than one direction. Do you often marry women because their fathers are desperate? No. The answer was so flat that, against her will, she almost believed him. He crossed to the table and laid 2 fingers on the contract. If fraud can be proved, the coercive portions may be broken. Not quickly, not cleanly, but law is sometimes less useless than people assume. Until then? Until then, you will come to Blackthorn. You will have separate rooms, full household authority where it concerns your comfort, and no demands beyond public civility. He met her gaze. If you wish never to forgive me, I will consider it reasonable. If you wish to survive this intelligently, I suggest we begin by seeing the paper as it is. Something inside her, taut with fury, altered shape. Not softened, sharpened. What do you gain, she asked, from being generous after profiting from the bargain? His expression did not change. I am not generous, Miss Vermont. I am practical, and practical men dislike building households on unstable lies. She almost laughed then, not from mirth, but from sheer astonishment. He was the first person in weeks who had spoken to her as if she possessed a mind worth briefing rather than a fate worth arranging. So she made the choice that changed everything. If I come, she said, I do not come as purchased decoration. I want access to the Blackthorn accounts. One dark brow lifted. You audit estates as part of your bridal accomplishments? I survived my father. That is a broader education. This time the corner of his mouth moved, only slightly. Very well, he said. Audit Blackthorn. The marriage took place 3 days later in a chapel so cold that Alina could see her breath. The county called it efficient. Women pitied her. Men admired Lucian's decisiveness. Gideon Vermont played the part of sorrowing father with enough skill to make Alina feel, for one savage instant, that she alone could see the obscenity beneath the lace. She did not cry. That disappointed people. Blackthorn House stood above the river on a rise of dark stone and winter-bare trees, with the furnace glow visible at night like banked anger on the horizon. The estate was larger than Vermont House, sterner in temperament, and far more disciplined. Nothing drooped there. Nothing was ornamental without purpose. Yet beneath the surface order, Alina sensed the strain almost at once. Invoices arrived late. Warehouse tallies contradicted shipping manifests. Repair charges climbed while machinery remained unreliable. Tenant complaints came wrapped in apologies that suggested they had not expected to be heard by anyone who mattered. Workers were paid through too many hands before coin reached them, which meant coin shrank along the way. On her second morning, Lucian found her in the old counting room with 3 ledgers open and a tray of untouched breakfast at her elbow. You have the look, he said. What look? Of a woman about to inform me that my household is bleeding from 6 places at once. 7, Alina replied. Possibly 8 if your charcoal contracts are as rotten as your river freight entries. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. No lord she had ever known would have done that without making the gesture feel like indulgence. Lucian did it as one professional might take a place opposite another. Begin wherever the blood is brightest, he said. So she did. Matthew Kersey had served Blackthorn for 7 years and enjoyed the sort of reputation men receive when they are loudly competent, generously social, and careful to let their employer appear above the vulgar machinery of profit. He blamed wartime disruption for losses. He blamed laborers for spoilage. He blamed river ice, broken roads, wet timber, careless clerks, and dishonest tenants. He always had an explanation. What he did not have, once Alina began tracing the books, was coherence. The fraud was not one grand theft, but a cultivated garden of smaller ones. Duplicate hauling fees, phantom labor names, supplies charged and resold, inferior pig iron passed against higher-grade inventory, wages delayed long enough for desperate workers to buy necessities on credit from stores tied quietly to Kersey's cousins, widows' allowances logged but only half distributed, repairs inflated through friendly contractors who returned a portion in cash. It was greed, certainly, but it was also a philosophy. Men like Kersey believed inefficiency was natural among the poor, secrecy was natural among the powerful, and theft was only vulgar if the wrong class committed it openly. When Alina showed Lucian the first confirmed pattern, she expected rage. What she got was worse. A kind of stillness that suggested rage had long ago learned to wear better clothes. "My father trusted him," Lucian said. "Your father was dying," Alina answered, "and Kersey built a system that rewarded distance at the top. He wanted gratitude from the man above him and dependence from everyone below." Lucian looked at her for a long moment. "You say that as if you have known the method intimately." "I married it first." That was the day respect became something neither of them had to pretend not to feel. They worked with increasing frankness after that. Alina did not merely identify theft. She studied flow, where fuel was wasted, where transport stalled, which foremen were feared but not obeyed, which widows and craftsmen kept real memory of the works while gentlemen discussed them abstractly in drawing rooms. She learned the rhythm of the furnaces, the warehouse keys, the timber schedules, the tenant roads, the week in which river mud made delay inevitable, and the month in which paying laborers promptly prevented 3 later losses elsewhere. Her reforms were simple enough to insult men who preferred complexity because it concealed them. Direct coin payment before the Sabbath, witnessed and signed. Receipts for widow allowances, copied in duplicate. Independent weighing at the dock. Contract renewal only after inventory matching. Penalty clauses for false charcoal volumes. Repair oversight moved from Kersey's circle to a blacksmith Alina trusted because he complained with too much detail to be dishonest.
A grain reserve for laboring families, priced at cost rather than desperation. Timber cutters paid on verified load counts instead of gentlemen's estimates. The first month, the board muttered that His Grace's new Duchess was playing merchant. The second month, leakage dropped. By the third, output stabilized. By the fourth, for the first time in years, Blackthorn could predict profit rather than merely pray for it. The workers noticed first, then the clerks, then the creditors, then society. And society, which forgives coercive marriage more easily than female competence, began searching for language that would make Alina's authority seem less real. She was called fortunate, then meddlesome, then unwomanly, then astonishingly useful. The wives of neighboring landholders asked for her advice in tones meant to suggest they were only amusing themselves. Men who had laughed at her figures now invited Lucian to dinner so they might ask, casually, whether the Blackthorn improvements might be explained. Lucian, to Alina's secret satisfaction, answered with maddening brevity. "My wife read the books," he would say, as if that were all, as if other men had simply neglected to marry women capable of rescuing them from their own complacency. Yet success created pressure as surely as failure did. Kersey understood before anyone else that he was being cornered. Gideon Vermont understood soon after, when Blackthorn's revival deprived him of the comforting story that Alina had been buried inside a colder ruin than his own. Together, though not always openly, they began to strike back.
A rumor surfaced that Alina had manipulated Lucian through intimacy and tears. A solicitor friendly to Gideon questioned whether the Vermont marriage settlement could expose Blackthorn to legacy liabilities. Clara received a proposal from a ridiculous widower with 3 children and no fortune, pressed with suspicious urgency. One of the furnace ledgers disappeared for 16 hours and returned missing 2 crucial leaves. A dock foreman who had agreed to testify regarding false weights was beaten badly enough to send a message. That night, Alina stood in the lower gallery, unable to sleep, the river below the hill black as poured ink. Lucian found her there with a cloak around his shoulders and placed it, without comment, over hers instead. "For a practical man," she said after a time, "you have developed the habit of appearing whenever the house begins to feel too narrow. For a woman who dislikes rescue, you sound almost grateful." She smiled despite herself. Then it faded. "They will go after Clara next." "Yes," he said. He did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "My mother's codicil protected her dowry separately," Alina said. "I know it did. I remember the red ribbon. I remember my mother saying Clara would never be at the mercy of another person's appetite. But the codicil is gone." Lucian rested one hand on the cold stone rail. "Then we find who benefited from its disappearance." "Sometimes," she said quietly, "I think that is what I cannot forgive. Not the debt, not even the sale, but that my father looked at everything my mother built for us and saw only assets he had not yet consumed." Lucian turned toward her then, fully. "When my father died," he said, 3 men I had dined with as a boy tried to carve Blackthorn apart before the mourning ribbons had yellowed. I learned something useful. Theft dressed as custom still leaves marks." She looked at him. That was one of the rare moments he spoke from the wound rather than the scar. And because he did, she answered with equal honesty. "I do not want merely to survive them." "Good," he said. "Neither do I." The codicil was found a week later where only a patient thief would have thought to hide it. Folded inside the false bottom of a survey tube in Gideon Vermont's old portmanteau, now stored in a locked chamber at Blackthorn, among the effects transferred after the marriage. Clara found the key sewn into the hem of a traveling cloak their father had not expected anyone to examine. That discovery changed the scale of everything. The codicil proved that Clara's dowry and a portion of Alina's maternal inheritance had been explicitly shielded from marital debt, speculative borrowing, and paternal reassignment. Gideon had not merely been desperate. He had knowingly circumvented their mother's legal protections. And because one fraud rarely travels alone, the same packet contained memoranda linking Gideon to Kersey's proxy shipments. At last, the 2 halves of the crime locked together. The marriage contract had not simply rescued a drowning father. It had hidden a chain of theft across 2 households. Alina made the final strategy. Not a private confrontation, not a plea through family, not a gentlemanly compromise that would preserve faces while cutting truth into polite fractions. A public reckoning at the winter dividend assembly, where Blackthorn's creditors, partners, and neighboring landholders would all be present, expecting good news and sober accounts. Let the men who worshipped profit witness what had nearly destroyed it. Let the same society that had called her traded property watch her interpret
the very books by which it measured power. When she proposed it, Lucian studied her for several quiet seconds. "There will be no path back to ordinary relations after this," he said. "There was none the night my father put the quill in my hand." He inclined his head. "Then we do it your way." So the room filled, so the ledgers were placed. So Gideon Vermont arrived wearing wounded dignity, and Matthew Kersey arrived wearing the anxious confidence of a man not yet sure whether he has been betrayed by luck or by intelligence. And so Alina stood at the table in Blackthorn's counting room and began to dismantle them. She did not rant. That was the beauty of it. She educated. Line by line, she walked the room through duplicate entries, diverted consignments, inflated repair orders, suppressed receipts, and false labor accounts. She produced copies of the widow disbursement lists and called, one by one, the names of women who had signed for sums they had never received. She compared charcoal tallies to actual furnace output and showed where the mathematics failed, even if morality did not. She laid out the codicil protecting Clara's future. Then, at last, she unfolded the marriage settlement and placed beside it a memorandum in Gideon's own hand, acknowledging debts he had attempted to sink beneath her signature. The silence after that was not empty. It was crowded with recognition. Gideon tried first. He called her emotional, misled, manipulated by a husband who desired greater reach over Vermont holdings. Alina answered before Lucian could breathe. "If His Grace desired greater reach," she said, "he would not have signed the separate instrument I now place before the room, affirming that any property restored through these proceedings shall revert according to my mother's codicil, and not by marital absorption." That was the blow Gideon had not imagined. Lucian had signed the paper the night before, not because she asked timidly, because she demanded that justice not become another elegant transfer from one powerful man to another. Several men in the room looked at the Duke with sudden, uneasy respect. Kersey broke next. He attempted to blame underclerks, then wartime confusion, then imperfect memory. But truth is hardest to improvise when a woman has arranged every ledger in the order of your undoing. By the time two widows, the dock weighmaster, and Blackthorn's own senior smith had spoken, Kersey's denials sounded less like defense than bad theater. Gideon reached for paternal outrage then, perhaps believing it his last useful costume. "I did what I must for my daughters," he snapped. Alina met his eyes across the ruined distance of the table. "No," she said, "you did what you wished, and used your daughters as language." It was not the loudest line spoken that day. It was only the truest. The assembly did what such rooms always do once certainty shifts. It moved quickly to the side least likely to stain it. Creditors demanded review. Partners withdrew support from Kersey. A magistrate's clerk was sent for. Papers were secured. Witness statements were taken before anyone could coach them into softness. Gideon Vermont, who had spent years making fraud sound like prudence, discovered that gentlemen forgive vice more readily than they forgive failed concealment. By dusk, Kersey was under formal inquiry. Gideon was facing civil seizure and criminal review on the forged protections. Clara's dowry was frozen in safety rather than risk. Blackthorn's works remained standing, and Alina, who had entered the marriage as collateral, left the room as the person everyone there now understood had saved the estate they came to measure.
After the last of the men had gone, she remained alone in the counting room, with the candles burning low. Her hands, at last freed from performance, began to shake. Lucian came back inside, carrying the separate instrument she had used to cut away his possible claim over her restored property. "You could have kept that for private files," she said. "I know. Most men would have." "Yes." He stopped a few feet from her. "I did not marry you as I ought to have. I will not build the rest of this life by taking advantage of the wrong that brought you here." Something in her chest gave way then, not in pain, but in release so deep it almost hurt. For months, she had fought to avoid being possessed by one system after another. Father, debt, gossip, law, gratitude, rescue. And now the one man powerful enough to fold her back into dependence stood before her, offering something rarer than affection. He offered proportion. He offered room. He offered choice. Alina stepped toward him slowly, as if testing whether the ground had truly changed. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought respect might be the most I could ever hope to feel for you." Lucian's expression sharpened in that watchful way of his. "And now?" "Now I think respect was only the doorway." He touched her face then with a care so controlled it felt more intimate than hunger. She leaned into his hand before she could stop herself, and the look that crossed his face at that small surrender was not triumph. It was reverence, stunned and quiet. Their first kiss did not erase the violence of how the marriage began. Nothing honest could. But it transformed the meaning of what would come after. Spring remade Blackthorn as thoroughly as Alina's books had. The furnaces ran cleaner. The dock accounts held. Tenant renewals improved. Widows received their full coin. Clara, secure at last, chose to study languages with an aunt in Annapolis rather than be hurried into any bargain. Requests began arriving from neighboring estates asking whether the Duchess of Blackthorn might quietly review harvest contracts, warehouse leaks, probate tangles, or shipping books no man in the family could explain without becoming defensive. Alina accepted only those cases in which she could work cleanly and on her own terms. That surprised society most of all. Women were expected to influence power, not to define its procedures. By summer, she had become what no one in her father's house had ever intended her to be. Not a sheltered daughter traded through debt, but a strategist whose name could steady a ledger, frighten a dishonest factor, and reassure a room full of people who suddenly wished they had listened to her sooner. Lucian watched this ascent with the same severe attention he gave everything that mattered. He did not stand in front of it. He stood beside it. Sometimes at supper, he would hand her a letter from a neighboring landholder and say, with the ghost of dry amusement in his voice, "Another gentleman has discovered that numbers are less obedient when women are absent." Sometimes she would find him in the counting room after dark, reading through revised furnace schedules, simply because he liked hearing her explain why the new route from the timber yards saved both coin and argument. Sometimes they would ride the boundary roads together in the early evening, saying little, because the intimacy they had built was not made of constant speech, but of earned ease. When their first child was born 2 years later, a daughter with Lucian's dark eyes and Alina's grave concentration, society called her fortunate. Alina smiled whenever she heard it. Fortune had had very little to do with any of it. What remade her life was not luck, nor rescue, nor rank. It was the decision, made in the moment everyone expected her to submit, to keep her mind awake. It was the discipline to turn humiliation into evidence, evidence into structure, and structure into freedom. And if Blackthorn prospered afterward, if regional commerce became cleaner because one woman refused to let theft masquerade as custom, if widows were paid, if daughters were better protected in settlements, if men with polished manners learned to fear audited books, then that too was part of the justice. Because the greatest reversal of all was not that Alina Vermont came to love the man she had been forced to marry. It was that the woman once treated as a line item became the author of the ledger.